Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Mem. We're going to get started from, let's go back and review the Mishna that we saw from the beginning of our chapter. We have a person who dies, as is the context of what we've been learning, and leaves over sons and daughters. The problem is that there might not have been enough money in the estate to cover everything. So in general, what's supposed to happen is the boys are supposed to inherit all the property, and from their inheritance, they're supposed to pay out food supplements to the daughters. We're going to talk about later what happened to the widow. She's also supposed to get money. Does she factor into this or not? That's going to be later. But right now, we seem to be ignoring her, and our issue is the sons and the daughters, and we distinguish between a lot of money in the estate or not a lot of money in the estate. If there's enough money in the estate to cover everything, then whatever I explained a minute ago is what happens. If there's not sufficient funds to cover that, which we had then a debate, what does it mean sufficient funds? We either said 1 year's supply for the boys and the girls, or enough supply for the boys and the girls to eat until the girls become of age, where the father is no longer responsible to feed them, which would either be their wedding, but we have no idea when they're getting married, so we don't use that as a calculation, but when they become a bogeret, which is 12 years and 6 months, approximately, depending on when they have signs of puberty. But 6 months after that, so we would assess it at around 12 years and 6 months, and we would assess how much they would need until then. If there's enough to cover both their food until then and the boys, then that's called mirubim. Anything less than that, it's called muatim, not enough. Those are the two different approaches. Is it 1 year's worth, or it could theoretically be many years' worth? Now, if there's not enough money, then what happens? So however we define what muatim means, what's supposed to happen then? We had a machloket, Tanakama and Admon. At least one way of reading it is there's a machloket. Another way is suggested in this week's Gefet with Shalhevet Schwartz is that perhaps it's not actually, Admon isn't actually disagreeing with the rabbis, but perhaps it's not her suggestion. It's just, you can hear it in the Shiur, it's Rabbanit's suggestion. Perhaps Admon's not actually disagreeing, but Admon is just raising a problem that he has with it. Not that he disagrees, he just says, this doesn't sit right with me. But what doesn't sit right? Well, what are the Tanakhama sit? The girls get money, the food for the money for food, and the boys have to go knocking on doors asking for charity. Okay, why the rabbis say this is a good question, why they think that the girls go first, either because there was this concept that, girls have less opportunity to make money in those days, thus they're more found in the house, and therefore, number one, it's not appropriate for them to go knocking on doors, not sanua, right? Girls shouldn't be going out and knocking on doors. And number two, the role is to make sure the girls have what they need, and the Yerusha is only beyond that. But Admon says, what, because I'm a male, I'm going to lose out? And he's very upset about this. Again, either he thinks, no, the boys get first, just hard to say because the rest of the sugya seems to, as we're going to learn today, seems to really be talking about the fact that the girls get mizono first. Or, like we said, maybe he's just saying, I have a bit of a problem with this, but not necessarily that I disagree. And then Amar Rabban Gamliel, Ro'ani Devrei Admon. Again, what's interesting in Gefet today is that what Shalhevet brings is these different approaches about how we know how to paskin halacha. And what's interesting about this sugya is it's a sugya that leads to many different interpretations here because it's unclear. And even though the Rashbam says very clearly, quotes the Gemara in Ketubot. By the way, we saw this whole Gemara in Ketubot with Admon because there was a series of Mishnayot that all discussed different things that Admon said. And on some of them, Rabban Gamliel said, Ro'ani Divrei Admon. And the Gemara there said, every time Rabban Gamliel says this, we hold like Admon, which definitely seems to indicate we hold like Admon here, unless Admon maybe doesn't disagree and is just raising a problem. But that's all for the Shiur of Gefet. We're going to get back to our Gemara. So the Gemara now asks on this, we had these two approaches, 12 months, or is it till the girls become of age? To which the last line in Kuf Lamed Tet, if there's not enough money for those and those until they get older, the boys and the girls, right? So let's say you start counting up. The boys need $10,000. The girls need $10,000. And there's $15,000, let's say. Shaklu banot lekulu. So wait. So the banot get all of it from mizonot? Because once it's muatin, right, the girls only need 10,000. What about the extra 5,000? Seems ridiculous. So we don't have enough money. So the girls get it all. The boys don't get anything? That seems weird. Ella Amarava, and theoretically, what would you think would happen? Well, the girls would get mizonot for those 10 years. When the 10 years are up, the boys can inherit, and the girls will continue to get mizonot, and at least the boys will get them. But in the meantime, the boys will be knocking on doors. That doesn't make sense. There's an extra $5,000 for them. Why don't they get that now? To which Ella Amarava Rava actually adjusts this a little and says, Motzi'in lahem mizonot labanot ad sheyivgeru, v'ashar labanim. Okay. If there were bank accounts in those days, what would they do? They would basically, they did something else instead, whatever they did in those days, but they separated out the money from the estate that the girls could get their mizonot from. Let's say it was that $10,000. That all is put aside for the girls. Whatever's left, the boys can inherit. But the main idea here is first we deal with the girls, then we can deal with the boys. But it doesn't mean they have to wait until the girls are already of age to inherit what's left for them. They just don't inherit first everything. And that's what's the reverse? The reverse is if there's enough money, if there's $20,000, then they'll inherit everything and they'll distribute the food to the girls and what they need. But in this case, the money for the girls gets separated out and the rest goes to the boys. Now the Gemara says, Pshita, it's obvious in the case we're going to bring, and then we're going to bring a question on the opposite case. Until now, we were saying that Merubin and Muatin, if there's a lot or a little money in the estate, it's going to be dependent on the moment of death. What if, though, things change after death? So originally, when the father died, there was Merubin, there was a lot of money, but Nitma too. But then all of a sudden, the money became less. Now, how could that happen if they set it all aside for the girls for the mizonot? Well, first of all, let's say the sons got some of it and they invested and it became a lot more. Or it could be the prices dropped. Okay, I know it doesn't happen so often, but the cost of living dropped. The cost of living drops and all of a sudden it becomes enough to cover both. Then, I'm sorry, I said the opposite. This is the opposite case. There was a lot and then nitma too. Sorry, I got confused for a minute with the next case. And then all of a sudden there was less. How could there be less? So the prices went up. The cost of living went up. And all of a sudden it's not enough to cover. Now, what happened in this case? When they were Merubin and the father died, the boys inherited and are now in charge of feeding the girls. And if they had been less at the time, the boys wouldn't have inherited at all. But now it's too late. The boys already inherited. So even if now it's not enough to cover both their cost of living and the girls' cost of living, the sons are already inherited. You can't take away an inheritance. Once you inherit, it's yours. So there's nothing to talk about in that case. We don't reassess and say, oh, now they're muatim, so now we're going to take them away from the boys and give it all to the girls. But muatim v'nitrabu mai. But what if they were fewer and became more? Either from an investment or, the cost of living went down and all of a sudden they don't need that much money to live on. And therefore, since they need less money to live on, now, theoretically, they're merubim. Do we allow the boys to inherit at this point? So what are the two sides here? Why would we say one or the other? Do things change? So if merubim b'nitma, nothing changes because the boys already inherited. We're not going to readjust. But in the reverse case, you might say, Bereshut Yorshim Kaime, Hilkach Bereshut Yorshim Shavua. In the case of Muatim, at the time of the father's death, there was not enough money. The boys are supposed to inherit. However, and that's by Torah law, right? But the girls need mizonot, and since there's not enough to go around, we're basically going to give the money to the girls. But it could still be, this is what we just read, Bereshut Yorshim Kaime. It really is still theoretically considered in the domain of the Yorshim. They're supposed to inherit. There's just something blocking and preventing them from inheriting. So therefore, you could say it was in their domain from the beginning. And in their domain, it's shabuach, means it went up in value. And therefore, they inherit now because it's theirs. It was theirs from the beginning, even though we couldn't give it to them. It was like a barrier there. But once we take away the barrier, it's as if it was theirs from the beginning. O Dilma, silugim masalkin yorshim mehacha. Or when we say there's not enough money to go around, perhaps we push them away and we say, listen, in this case, you don't inherit. So therefore, the girls get the money for the mizonot, and perhaps that money is given to them and it's theirs. And we don't take it away from them and give it to the heirs because the heirs were already written out of the will, so to speak, because of the lack of funds. So just because there's more funds now doesn't mean that now all of a sudden they're going to inherit. So that's the deliberation. Now we're going to try to come up with an answer, and we're actually going to be successful. Tashma, let's learn from here. Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Asi said the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Yitomim shekadmu umachru b'nechasim muatin, masher machru. If there were not enough funds in the estate, and the girls were supposed to get them from Mazono. Now, there's a debate among the commentaries whether this is talking about before the court assesses and divides it, or maybe even after the court assessment, when it's determined that it goes to the girls. And then the boys came along, took the property, and sold it. So now they say, Masha machu machu. What they sold is sold. The girls, by the way, can't get Mazono from lien property. So now the property's sold, they're not going to be able to get their Mazono. And what's done is done. Now, you can only say that if we view them as heirs, even when there's nechasim muatim. Because if they're not heirs, if I go into I sign a contract selling your property to somebody else, it's obviously an invalid contract. So if the boys really had no ownership rights to the estate, which theoretically, according to one of the options we just said, they don't. And that's why we're not going to change anything once the amount of money in the estate changes or the value of it changes. But here, if their sale is a valid sale, that means that they actually do inherit. It's just that we're preventing them from accessing their funds because it needs to go to the girls. But it's still theirs. And if they were to have sold it, it's a valid sale. So therefore, if all of a sudden now the cost of living goes down, or for whatever reason the money goes up in value, we're going to now reassess, and the boys will inherit, and the girls will get paid their food supplements from the boys, from their inheritance. Now comes Rabbi Yirmiya. If you remember, he always asks those questions. Sometimes they're like nitpicky questions, and sometimes they're actually very good, legitimate, valid questions. So Yativ Rabbi Yirmiya, and sometimes it's unclear. You could say it one way, say it the other. But now I think he has a pretty good question here. He says, and I mentioned this, that we were going to get back to this. We talked about how much money is considered a little or a lot, and we said it depends on, right? We take out from the estate, we start deducting, we make deductions. We say, well, this sounds like a class in accounting, right? And bookkeeping. So we have X money in the estate, but there's the food supplements have to go to the girls, right? We take that down. We need to feed the boys for the year. So, we deduct that. But there's other things that the estate has to pay. So we're now going to ask about one and then the other and then the other. So we're just going to have 3 questions, and then we'll see a 4th at the end. So Rabbi Yirmiya was sitting Kamei de Rabbi Avau in front of Rabbi Avau, v'kabai minei, and he starts asking him, Almanuto ma'u shetemei b'nechasim. The widow also needs to get food supplements. So do we deduct, let's just go with the year, it's the simplest. Do we say, okay, a year's worth of food for the boys, for the girls, and for the wife, the widow, or not? Mi amrina, and here are the 2 sides of the question. Mi amrina, now why would she be any different? It's an obligation just like the daughters, that the estate of the father has to feed her. Well, do we say, kevan de'ila mazone mimata, which would be the obvious, since she's supposed to get food supplements, we deduct that as well in determining a lot or a little, how much is in the estate, and what do we do with it? Oh, Dilma kevan de'ilu minsaba leitla, hashanami leitla. Or do we say, look, her time is perhaps limited. She might get married tomorrow, and then she's not a factor here, because as soon as she gets married, she doesn't get mizonot anymore. So since that's something that might end, perhaps we don't consider it. Im timtzalomar, and if you're going to say, kevan de'ilu minsaba leitla, hashanami leitla. Now, if you want to answer the previous question, this is always a famous structure in the Gemara, where we don't actually give an answer, but we say, if you're going to answer question A like this, I'm going to ask a further question. I'm going to have question B. And then if you're going to answer question B like that, I'm going to move to question C. So if you're going to say, look, she could potentially get married and the responsibility will end, and therefore hashtanami leila, therefore she's not factored in. Bat ishto ma'u. This is a case that we learned about in Ketubot. Bat ishto means, what if the woman came into the marriage with a daughter and the widow? When they got married, she had a daughter from a previous marriage, and she asked the husband to commit in the ketubah that he was going to pay for her food for 5 years. Okay, just for an example. She gave a certain number of years. She said, I will marry you, but I want you to commit that you're going to pay my daughter food for 5 years. Now, that 5 years is not dependent on the mother dying, on the mother being alive or not. That 5 years, so when the husband dies, first of all, it's a commitment that not only does he have to keep, but his children have to keep, the estate. So she needs to get paid for 5 years. Let's say he dies in year 2. There's still 3 more years left. And if if the mother, the widow, were to die, which we just said before, what if she dies? I'm sorry. What if I got confused. What if she gets married, right? If she gets married, he's no longer obligated to pay her food supplements. But he is obligated, and his estate is obligated to pay the daughter's food supplements because that wasn't dependent on the mother getting married. That was a commitment. It's like any contract. The husband basically wrote, I will pay food for this girl for 5 years. So even if the widow is to get married and therefore sever her ties with the husband's estate, her daughter still has the commitment. Because the father's estate has the commitment to the daughter because it was a 5-year commitment. It wasn't dependent on anything. A ketubah and mizono in the ketubah is the husband commits to pay the widow food supplements until such time that the wife gets remarried. Or if you remember, we had all these debates in ketubah, maybe when she puts on makeup and is already looking to get married, once she starts dating, right? There were different things. They didn't have dating there as a list, but they did have makeup. They had once she can demand the lump sum of her ketubah, she doesn't get mizonot. There's an end to that. But this daughter is getting for 5 years no matter what, other than we'll see one thing, and I see you already asked in the chat. Yes, we'll get to that. And that's why I got confused before. If she dies, that's something else. Okay, if the daughter herself is dead, then her heirs can't demand the money. That's the only one thing. It was specifically for her, not for her heirs. But we're going to get to in a minute. So that's the question. Those are the two sides. Mi amrinan kevan d'chimintzeba itla umemata. Are we going to say, even if the mother were to get married, or even if the daughter were to get married, in other words, even if she herself gets married, it's still an obligation for him to pay her. And therefore, memata, because again, the commitment was a 5-year commitment or whatever, however many years, was totally not dependent on her remarrying, the widow remarrying, anything. O dilma, or do we say, kevan de'ilu meta leitla velo memata? Or do we say, no, but maybe she could drop dead. If she drops dead, the commitment's off. It's not like something her heirs are going to be able to demand. That's not that kind of obligation. So maybe we don't deduct this amount because maybe she'll die. Now you have to wonder why they didn't ask that about the girls before. Maybe they'll die, or maybe the sons will die. Maybe there'll be less people to feed. They didn't factor that in now. This is like an additional thing. So they're saying, well, here, maybe that would be a factor. And the reason why they really said this is to set it up with the third case, the third question. If you say, look, this is an obligation that might end because she might die and that will be the end of the obligation. And therefore, lo memata. But bal chov, but if there was a creditor, this is why I thought of accounting, right? When you say, this is how much money I have at the end of the year, right? And you file, depending on what this is, if a business, right? They always want to know, well, what other obligations do you have? Because it's not really what you have in the bank is not really what you own because there's other things that are going to come out, right? That you have obligations to other people. And they always put that in the accounting for the year in the financial statements. So likewise here, you say, look, Baal Chov, if someone's owed money, well, that's going to come out of the estate. So that means the estate doesn't really have what we think it has. So does that deduct the number? Mi amrina, and here again, the two sides. Do we say, Kevan dechimai nami, Kevan dechimai nami itle, mimait? Do we say, look, even if the Baal Chov were to die, like the previous, right? When she's to die, well, there's no obligation anymore. But if a creditor dies, if I owe someone money, and then I die, I would have to, right? My heirs would have to pay what I owe. So therefore, it continues, and it has nothing to do with death or not, and therefore it's going to happen, and therefore we should deduct it. O Dilma, and that's why this is the most likely to be considered a deduction according to this line of arguing. O Dilma kevan demechasre guvaina lo memait. Or maybe we say, look, In the end, it has to be collected. We don't know when it'll be collected. Maybe they'll collect it in 10 years when we're way past this time frame of, counting mizonot. Maybe, we have no idea when it'll be collected. It still needs collection. Because it needs collection, it's different. And therefore, maybe lo mimai. So we don't have an answer to any of these questions. But if you remember, we talked about this, how the Rambam says whenever there's an intim tzilomar, and then meaning we have one question and then if you answer this, it leads to a next question. If you answer that, leads to the next question. All the if you answer that, we actually hold by. It's a possible way of paskening. Again, this leads to a question of how do we pasken, because it's a question. We also have the principle of hamotzi mechaver or alav haraya. So maybe the burden of proof would be on whoever's trying to get the money out. It's not clear how we pasken anyway. That's not our role to do here. But it's important because in the second version, the intim telomers are going to be slightly different. Some people learned this whole slew of questions that Rabbi Yirmiya asked was in the opposite direction. The same logic applies, but the intim telomers are slightly different. Baal Chov, and they're not going to spell them out, we're just going to have to think about it. But Baal Chov, he started with the Baal Chov, and he asked, Baal Chov, ma'u shemema'eh b'nechasim. Can a Baal Chov make the estate, do we deduct it when we calculate if they're a lot or a little? Turning now to Amud. Bat ishto, ma'u shetima'eh b'nechasim. Now, they don't give you the intim telomers, but you could fill it in. Now, here you'd be starting off with, it's the same logic. So the Baal Chov would be the most likely to be mema'eh. So now you'd say like this. If you're going to say we do deduct it, which would then mean we would hold that way because that's the first intim tzelomer. If you'd say we do, whereas in the last one, it just ended as an open question. If you say we deduct, then bat ishto ma'ush timei b'nechasim. What about if it was this commitment to the daughter? And then if you're going to say that counts as a deduction, which would also be different from the intim tzelomar about her in the previous, what you're left with is the question about the widow. And then the conclusion, if you really go by the intim telomar, by each, if you're going to say that, then I lead to the next question, but we'll go by if you say that, it would come out different depending on the order of his question. It's still the same order in a logical way. It's still the same that the Baal Chov is most likely to be the one we're going to deduct, the creditor, and the widow is going to be the least likely to deduct it. But again, what conclusion you might come to halachically about it would be different. If you didn't follow all that, don't worry. That's not the basic part of the Gemara. The basic part of the Gemara is the questions were asked in a different order. What I'm trying to tell you is who cares if they were asked in a different order? What's the relevance? And that would really be one of the things that would be majorly relevant. Because again, the logic is the same. It's just a matter of what was the starting point. Now we're going to move to a fourth question. And that's why I said there's three questions of Rabbi Yirmiya. We saw them as 1, 2, 3 or 3, 2, 1. And now we get to a fourth question. Amanuto ubat ezemehen kodemet. Well, if you have the widow to feed and you have the daughter to feed, who comes first? Let's say there's not enough money to go around. So who gets first, the widow or the daughter? Amrle. Now, after Rabbi Yirmiya asked Rabbi Yavau all these questions, because we didn't really answer any of them, Amrle zil ha'ida b'tala machar. Go and come back tomorrow at the same time. Give me 24 hours. Right? A classic answer. I don't know. I need some time to think about it. Ki ata, when he came back 24 hours later, Amar lei, pshat miachada. I have an answer to one of your questions. I can't answer all your questions, but I do have one answer, and it's to the last one. To Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Asi, asu amana etzel abat kebat etzel achim b'nechasim muatim. We're going to do an analogy. In almana, a widow to the daughter is like the daughters to the sons when there's not enough money. Meaning, just like when it comes to the daughter and the sons, if there's not enough money to go around, the sons are the ones who have to ask for charity. The widow gets the money and for her food, and the daughters have to go knocking on doors. Why is this? So some of the commentaries say that it's obvious that a husband would want to treat his wife better. In other words, he'd want to make sure that his wife wasn't the one knocking on doors, and therefore he would make sure to provide for her first and the daughters only after. Not that he doesn't want to help the daughters, but his first priority would be to his wife, and from there, then the children would have to get charity. That's one possible way of explaining it. In any case, that's what he says, and he says, so I have an answer to your almanah v'bat, who comes first, but I can't answer your other question. Now we're moving on to Admon. Admon Omer, b'shvil shani zachar k'psadati, right? So now we have to understand this statement of Admon. And we're going to understand it eventually a little bit different than we understood it yesterday, right? I called it like a feminist question coming from a man. I'm not sure if there's a word for that, but kind of saying, what? That's not fair. Just because I'm a man, I'm going to lose out. So what does he mean here? Abai and Rav are going to have different interpretations, and we saw this exact sugya in Ketubot when we quoted this in Ketubot. Amar Abai, hachi kamar. What he really meant to say was like this. Bishvil she'ani zachar v'ra'oi ani la'asok b'torah hifsadati. Says, I'm a male, and I'm supposed to be learning Torah. I have to now go stop learning Torah and go knock on doors and collect charity. That's going to be what we call bitul Torah. Now, girls either aren't learning Torah anyway, or even if they are, they don't have an obligation to learn Torah like I do. So therefore, my time, what he's basically saying is more important than their time. So why? He says it doesn't make any sense that the boys will have to leave the Beit Midrash and go knocking on doors instead of the girls. That's his claim. You think about it, Abaye was poor and he learned. And he perhaps also had to knock on doors to make a living. And it's possible that he identified with that and was, very much felt strongly that this doesn't seem right, that I should have to go knocking on doors. It's not clear he had sisters, and it's not clear that they weren't, he wanted them instead. But Abaye understands this concept from, perhaps, I'm just suggesting, from his life experience. It's a possible way of looking at it. Amarle Rava doesn't like this answer at all. And Rava says, Ela me'ata, man asik b'Torah hu diyarit, de lo asik b'Torah lo yarit. Why are you bringing in this factor of who learns Torah, who doesn't learn Torah? Because if you're doing that and you're saying boys learn Torah, girls don't learn Torah, and that's why the boys shouldn't be the ones struggling, the girls, should have to go knock on doors. He says, wait, you're going to say then, if there's not a lot of money, let's say in the father's estate, so the ones who learn Torah should get the money, and the sons who don't learn Torah shouldn't get the money? In other words, Rav is saying, look at the world. Not all boys learn Torah. Not all male children learn Torah. Not everybody's sitting in yeshiva. So the ones who aren't are the ones who are more responsible to fend for themselves. And of course, that's not true. The laws of inheritance of the Torah give equal share to all the children, right? If it's boys, boys, if it's girls, girls, having nothing to do with whether they learn Torah or don't learn Torah. So you said, why are you bringing this in as a factor? This can't be what Admon meant. Okay, again, it's not like Abai is saying this is the truth. Abai is just trying to understand Admon's position. So Rava says, I don't buy your answer. It doesn't stand to the test because there is no such distinction when it comes to laws of inheritance. Ela Rava hachikamar. Rava brings his own interpretation. Bishvil shani zachar v'ra'oi ani lirash b'nechasim berubim hifsadati b'nechasim muatim. He says, look, by Torah law, let's even say it in a bit of a different term. By Torah law, boys inherit the property, not the girls. The Torah gave the boys much more strength in inheritance than the girls. The girls don't get inheritance unless there's no boys. And the mizonot is all something later. Remember, that was the Tanai Ktubin Dichrin, Benot Nukvan, that the rabbis instituted that we add to the Ketubah that the girls will be taken care of. So if it's Nechasim Merubim, everyone agrees the boys come first, and that's a clear thing that the boys get top priority. So all of a sudden, because there's less money, we're going to make the boys lose out. The boys have more of a hold on this money than the girls in general. So why, just because there's not enough money, are we all of a sudden switching things and giving the girls more power than the boys? Doesn't make any sense. And then this isn't a as you said in the chat, thanks, reverse discrimination or something like that. That it's not exactly reverse discrimination though, because it's not saying but anyway, however we call it, but it's not, because we're boys, it's this halakha already, these laws of Yerusha gave all the power to the boys over the girls. So why are we shifting things just because there's not enough funds? And that perhaps is Admon's question. Okay, and that's how the Gemara seems to conclude that Rava has the final word, knocked out Abaye, and that's really his question, that it just doesn't fit in with the natural rules of inheritance, which is interesting because that was Rava's problem with Abaye, that where Abaye was saying didn't fit in with the natural rules of inheritance. No one ever said it had anything to do with Torah. For sure, practically speaking, we don't differentiate between children who learn and children who don't learn. So, but yes, It really has to do with the basic laws of inheritance. The boys always come first. So why all of a sudden are we shifting it just because there's not enough money? Now, one could come up with an explanation for the rabbis, but that's Admon's issue. Now we're going to get to, again, this is how they understood Admon's issue. We don't really know what Admon's issue was. A lot of generations passed between Admon and Rava, right? Rava being fourth generation Amora. I don't remember what generation Admon lived in, but it was definitely Tanaim, so at least 4 generations earlier. And we're trying to have a deliberation about what exactly somebody meant. We don't really know, but they're suggesting. That's the end of this section. Maybe we'll even review the daf before we go on. So what we did so far is we talked about the situation where banim merubim, nechasim merubim versus nechasim muatim. We discussed, number one, how do we assess what's the amount of money we need? How is that amount assessed? Both in terms of how much money of mizonot and mizonot of who, which we were left with big open questions. Is it just that we deduct the mizonot of the boys and the girls? Or what about do we deduct what the widow needs? Do we deduct what her daughter needs if that was a commitment in the ketubah? And do we deduct if there was a creditor? So that was a question that we didn't answer. We also saw what happens if the money changes down the road. And in the end, we say really the banim have rights to inherit in that way, right? If it all of a sudden goes up in value. And then we discussed this other question, what if there's not enough for the widow and the daughter, who comes first? And we actually say the widow comes first before the daughter. And then we got to 2 explanations of Admon. So that's a summary of the first part of today's daf, okay, or the bulk of today's daf. Now we're going to finish off with the next Mishna and a little bit of discussion about it. What we're now moving into is a tumtum and androgynous, but we're really going to focus on the tumtum. These are people that are born with either covered genitals, and we're not sure if they're male or female, which puts them in a category. Generally, we call it a suffix, although today we're going to learn there's 2 different approaches to treating a tumtum and androgynous. Androgynous is someone with with both male and female genitalia. What the 2 approaches are, one is to say they're both safek zachar, safek nekeva. So it falls into our classic laws of sfekot, which have all sorts of issues like hamotzi mechaver alav haraya. You want to take money, you have to prove it, right? But you might be one or the other, and we'll see some other ramifications of that. Another approach, which we're going to see is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, is that these are called birya b'fnei atzma. They're a creature in and of itself, it means, okay, or a creation in and of itself, meaning they're not male, they're not female. It's something else. It's a 3rd category, okay? It's not a suffix. It's just something else. This comes up in a bunch of different other things as well, besides tumtum. It comes up in koi. If koi is an animal or is a domesticated or a non-domesticated animal. And then the question is, or maybe it's something else entirely. It's not either a behema or a chaya. Same thing here. So now we start with our Mishna. Hiniach banim ubanot v'tumtum. So what if there were boys, there were girls, and there were tumtum? By the way, tumtum comes from the Hebrew word atum, which is sealed. So that's your etymology of the word. Bizman, because it sounds like a bit of a weird word. Bizman shanechasim berubim. So what if there's a lot of money and the boys inherit? So obviously, what are we going to say? The tumtum can't inherit with the boys because hascharim dochino toetz on the keva. The boys say, oh, you collect with the girls because you can't prove you're a boy. And again, hamotzi mechaver alav haraya. So again, this is going to all depend who's trying to get money from who. If there's a lot of money, then it's the boys who inherit. And therefore, the boys are going to say, well, you can't prove it, so get like the girls. Nechasim muatim, obviously, if there's not enough money, it's going to be the reverse. The girls get sustenance. So when the tumtum comes and says, hey, I want sustenance, the girls say, oh, go collect with the boys, which basically means you're not going to get anything. Or maybe if there's a little left over, you'll get that, but you're not getting food payments like we get because you can't prove you're a girl. This sounds like the tumtum is a suffix because what it sounds like, although we're going to see there's 2 different interpretations, is that the tumtum collects like the girl in the case of a lot of money and collects like the boy in the case where there's not a lot of money. But the tumtum does collect. If you say the tumtum is what we call a birya b'fnei atzma, not zachar, not nekeva, not a ben, not a bat, then not male, not female, then the tumtum can't collect at all because boys get inheritance, girls get sustenance, and tumtum doesn't get anything because they're not male or female. Ha'omer, okay, now we have a different case, totally different case, but it has to do with the tumtum. Some people think this is someone on their deathbed and they're leaving a pregnant wife. Some people think it's not on their deathbed. It's a commitment for when I die by a healthy person saying, if my wife gives birth to a male, then I promise 100 zuzim to that child. Okay, so im teled ishti zachar yitol maneh. The child will get 100 zuzim. Yalda zachar yitol maneh. So this was a promise, even though, now there's a problem with this, he's being makneh, giving something to someone who's not in the world yet. What's more not in the world than a fetus, right? It's not there yet. But some people say, because the father really wants the child to come into the world and wants to give the child a gift, it's valid. Some people say he has to do it with a kinyan with someone else. In other words, he has to be mezakeh. We've talked about that before, giving rights to someone else for this on behalf of the unborn child. And maybe that would work. Anyway, that's a side point. If he says, Im teledishti nikeva matayim, I'll give 200 if it's a girl. Yaldan nikeva notelet matayim. Interesting here that right, you would think if they're giving an example, they always wanted male children, they would promise more money to the male than the female. And this Mishnah ends up they're promising more money to the female, double the amount. But anyway, they're just bringing examples. If she's female, right, then I'll give her 200. And if she's female, right, she gets 200. Im zachar maneh in nikeva matayim. What if he said if it's a male, 100, if it's female, 200? In other words, he gives both possibilities. So, v'yalda zachar unikeva. There's two ways to read this line. Vav in a Mishnah often could mean and, like it usually does, and sometimes it means or. So some people read it as Yalda Zachar Unikeva. If she gave birth to twins, and he said, if it's a male, I'll give this. If it's a female, I'll give that. Well, Zachar no tel maneh Nikeva no telet matayim. So both of them get. Some people say, okay, the Rashbam raises this problem. No way, no how. He meant if it's this, that, if it's that, that. He didn't mean both. He didn't mean I'm going to give out 300 zuz. So it must mean what he said was, if it's male, this, or if it's female, that, and then either she gave birth to a male or she gave birth to a female. If it was a male, they'll get this. If it was a female, they'll get that. It's one way to explain, but it seems to be like it is talking about twins, and they would get it because he committed male this, female that. And obviously it takes into account that what we know is obvious. In those days, they didn't really know that they were giving birth to twins, although you do see in the Torah that Rivka knew she was having twins, but putting that aside, right, generally people did not know. No ultrasounds or anything like that. Now, Yaldat Tumtum, and this is why we're here, because they want to get to the Tumtum case. Now, you said Zachar, you said Nekeva, the Tumtum is Safek. So what would you say? Let's talk about it. The Tumtum is Safek. Well, you said 100 for a male, 200 for a female, and you ended up with something that we're not sure. Now, we have this term that we've used before, yesh bichlal matayim maneh. Within 200 is 100. So you've at least committed 100. So if it's male, they'll get 100. If it's female, 200. So since we're not sure, they should get 100. But that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says, Yadat tumtum eino notel. And that's because this part of the Mishnah is clearly holding like Rashbag, who says a tumtum is not male or not female. It's its own unique, independent category. Imamal. But if he says, whatever my daughter, I'm just happy for my wife to have a child. I don't care it just says anything, whatever this is that my wife gives birth to will get X amount of money. Then the tumtum can get, because that obviously includes the tumtum as well. When it comes to inheriting the property, so even though we said it's not like a boy, it's not like a girl, let's say they can each push him off and say, you get like this, you get like that. But if there's no boys, there's no girls, and just a tumtum, obviously yoresh et hakol. Even if you consider it a birya b'fnei atzma, its own unique category, it's still a child of the father, and therefore will be the one to inherit. So now the Gemara points out what I pointed out before, which is dochinoto v'shakel kebat. It sounds like dochinoto. The boys say, if there's a lot of money, the boys say go take like the girls, and then it sounds like the tumtum will get mizonot. But from the second part of the Mishnah, hakatani seifa yaldat tumtum eino notel. The tumtum doesn't get the 100, even though if it's safek, it would get the 100. So Amar Abaye, we're going to have two explanations of the first line in the Mishnah. Dochino tova ein lo. Abaye says, when we said the boys push him off and say, push this tumtum off and say, you're going to get like the girls, it didn't mean the tumtum's going to collect like the girls. No. You're going to get like the girls means stop bothering us. You're not getting Yerusha. Go try to claim it from the girls' part. And then we'll go to the girls, and the girls will say, you're not female, you don't get it like us. And the tumtum actually gets nothing. And that fits perfectly with the tumtum getting nothing in the second part, which is, again, it's a birya bifnei atzma. But Rava Amal, classic Rav and Abaye again arguing, dochin oto v'yeshlo. Now, read it the way we simply read the Mishnah. The tumtum collects like the girls or like the boys, depending on, right, gets the worst, but does get something. The Seifa Atan Rav Shimon Gamliel. And then basically what Rav is saying is the Mishnah is made up of two parts. There's one part, which is one person's opinion, that the tumtum is a safek. The second part of the Mishnah is someone else's opinion completely, Rashbag's opinion. How do we know this is Rav Shimon Gamliel's opinion, besides that I told you, but it comes up in the following Mishnah. It says Ditanya, but it should be Ditanan. It's a Mishnah in, where is it? In Tmura. Yalda, we're talking about animals now. Someone's had an animal that was pregnant, and the person said, if it's a male, I want to bring it as a korban ola, because korban ola can only be brought from a male animal. If it's a female, I want to bring it as a korban shlami. Either which way, it's going to be sanctified. It's just a matter, will it be an ola, will it be a shlami? If yalda tumtum v'androginus, but if the animal gave birth to one of these types, which is not clear male or female, or it's both, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel omer ein kedusha chala alehem. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel views this as its own unique entity and therefore says nothing. Okay, there's no sanctity on this animal at all because there's nowhere for the sanctity to go because it's not a suffix here. If it was a suffix, the animal would be, right, suffix shlamim, suffix ola would definitely be sanctified. So here you see Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's opinion. According to Rava, the Mishnah is made up of two different parts. The first part matches people who disagree with Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and view the tumtum and androgynous as a suffix. And the second part goes according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that it's a birya bifnei atzma. So there's two ways to read that first line of the Mishnah. Does each side push off the tumtum and the tumtum gets nothing, and then it would match the second part of the Mishnah? That's Abaye. Or is it like Rava that the tumtum is viewed here in two different ways? It's just they forgot to tell us that we're dealing with two different opinions here, right? Obviously, Rava is a more difficult pshat. We do this sometimes in the Mishnah when we have no choice. But, okay, we're going to stop here and we'll get to the Meitive and the difficulty tomorrow. So with that, I already kind of summarized, so we'll stop here and wishing everyone a good day and b'savot tova.